Welcome, everyone. We appreciate you coming out for the program on such a beautiful evening. Thank you very much for coming over to Elmer Andersen Library and the Department of Archives and Special Collections. I am Linnea Anderson. I'm the archivist of the Social Welfare History Archives, and I'm hosting this evening's event along with Cecily Marcus from the Givens Collection of African Literature and Chris Kiesling, head of the Department of Archives and Special Collections. And we'll start with a brief welcome from Chris.
Thanks, Linnea. I just want to add my words of welcome to hers. It's great to see everyone here, and promises to be a very different and interesting event for the libraries, which is really wonderful. And how did we get here? Well, in 2016, the libraries received an estate gift from Bob Olson, who was a retired cataloger in the university libraries. Those who knew him described him as a thoughtful colleague who was superbly skilled in providing intellectual access to our collections. With a portion of his gift, the libraries developed a 3-year program to make funds available to staff for innovative ideas. Proposals for awards were focused on a possible investment that would make a difference in the work of the unit or the libraries and align with unit or library's goals. The Department of Archives and Special Collections was a recipient of the 2017 Bob Olson Staff Innovation Award. The group of Archives and Special Collections and other library staff submitted a proposal for an artist residency program to promote the use of historical collections to inspire works of art, build connections between artists and archives, and support artists who use historical sources in their work. We hope to use the award to create something to go beyond the libraries and are thrilled to have the results unfolding this semester through 3 talented and innovative art artists. And now Linnea is going to come back up here and talk a little bit more about the process that we went through to select these fine artists.
Thank you, Chris. So the library's Artists in Residence program chose these 3 distinguished artists for an artist in residence at Archives and Special Collections in the University of Minnesota Libraries for the spring semester in 2018. Valerie Caesar, Rini Yun Keagy, and Johnnay Leenay spent the semester engaged in exploratory projects to create and inform art with history and historical documents. So this process began with the development and promotion of a request for proposals, and we were thrilled to receive such a terrific response. Cecily, was it 98 applications? 93 applications were received. So we formed a subcommittee to review all of those applications. The subcommittee selected finalists, and then those were reviewed by the entire Olson Award Committee to select the 3 residents. And the residency gave artists a chance to explore historical collections and use other resources in the University of Minnesota Libraries. Each residency consisted of research consults with Archives and Special Collections staff and other library staff, including biomedical libraries and the Borchard Map Libraries, and technical consults and assistance from Digital Art Sciences and Humanities and Libraries Media Services. Residents were able to schedule focused research time using materials from Archives and Special Collections and work with curators to find more materials to suit their projects. They were given tutorials as needed on finding and using archival materials and developed work-in-progress talks, and were also given digitization or scanning services as needed. Each artist in residence has prepared a presentation on their work in progress. And tonight we are going to start with a video from Valerie Caesar. Valerie, unfortunately, is not able to be with us this evening. She lives in Brooklyn. But she sent a pre-recorded video presentation, The Black Magic Woman Project. And Valerie Caesar's work uses a dynamic mix of media, including photography, video, printmaking, animation, and Black vernacular music, speech, and literature, and centers around the magic of diasporic self-discovery in urban city centers. Valerie explores the tensions between the modern diasporic self and the ancestral self. A graduate of Cornell University and Columbia University School of Law, Valerie was the 2012 Volkswagen Fellow for the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and in 2014 became the first recipient of the Marilyn Nance Archive Fellowship. She currently works as an independent media consultant and is a board member of the Umbra Search African American History Project. And now are going to watch the video that Valerie has sent in.
My name is Valerie Caesar, and I'm an artist and writer originally from Brooklyn, New York. I work in the photographic arts, and my main form of expression is street photography and video, usually candid shots of Black people in urban environments being themselves, beautiful, tired, irascible, buoyant, solid, and gifted. Over the past couple of years, I've developed a video form that I have yet to name, but I like to think of them as moving portraits. They are Black bodies moving in slow motion. The aim is to truly give the viewer a chance to ponder the wonder and beauty of Blackness in its myriad forms, slowly, deliberately, and with care and appreciation. At the heart of my artwork and my research in Minnesota is this question: what is the wonder of Blackness? We've been told and shown by others for so long that we are not wonderful that it'd be easy to claim it as a defiant, reactionary impulse. But it is a wonder. The objects and the energies that African diasporan women have manifested despite the distorting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. How have we done this? The answer must be something that subverts logic, that defies the hard sciences, that transcends the ordinary will. The answer, simply, must be magic. So this research has been an exploration of the how. What are the tools that Black people, and particularly Black women, use and have used to create magic and subvert subjugation? I'm interested in how Black women, using conscious and unconscious diasporic connections with ancestral and modern methods, have shaped our urban approaches to a resynthesis of spirit and our ability to manifest desirable personal and communal outcomes. In other words, I'm investigating modern ritual practices of healing and magic. I'm looking to gather documentation on contemporary African American diasporan urban practices for healing and manifestation that evolve from a mashup of family tradition, African religious retentions, antebellum survival traditions, European religious influences, capitalistic maneuvering, superstition, subverted queerness, addiction and trauma, etc., and how these things evolve into expressions of visual art, music, dance, adornment, prayer, athleticism, therapy, etc., to form ritual, the methods of personal myth-making that shape our ethos and the craftsmanship of the talisman that protect us. In approaching my research, I knew I wanted to dig into collections that explored strong magical female characters in Black women's literature, the path of Black women authors themselves challenged by the limitations of their time and by supremacy and oppression, African American spirituality and African religious retentions, especially with regard to women, ideas of female cosmic spirituality and matriarchal religions, myths about women in African masking, trances, dance, and festivals, Black children and their mothers, especially literature that explores this relationship, Black women in the performing arts, Black women in the visual arts, and governmental policies affecting Black women, including domestic violence, reproductive rights, housing, etc. With the help of collections curators and administrators like Linnea Anderson, Cecily Marcus, Kate Hudja, and others, I gathered items from the Givens Collection, University Archives, and the Social Welfare History Archives. On my first day in the archives, I spent several hours and made it through a total of 15 files, out of dozens. Over the next few days, I found that the information I was exploring was so rich that I was inspired, commanded, forced to listen to the themes that kept emerging from them. They're a subset of the original proposal and a world within themselves. The information I gathered suggested to me an arc that expressed itself in 5 buckets: healing mentorship, which can be expressed through the symbolism of a family tree, Black women philosophy, expectation of others, the costs, the gains, and the costs and the gains relate to choices that these Black women and Black women characters make. Some of the richest materials were found in the Gibbons collection of African American Literature's Ephemera collection. Out of those boxes, I found works by authors such as Lorraine Hansberry, Maya Angelou, Gwendolyn Brooks, Lucille Clifton, Audre Lorde, Toni Morrison, Ntozake Shange, and Eartha Kitt. And just exploring the personal works of some of those authors was an anointing experience, a thrilling experience that I am really grateful for. Ultimately, the shape that this research may take is myriad. The idea was to learn about and find empowerment in discovering, identifying, and ultimately creating a philosophy of the Black magic woman, the foundation of which is healing through ritual. With regard to text, I'd love to write a book or a primer. Visually, I'm interested in pairing some of the still and moving images that I've taken of Black women in urban settings with the words and quotes of some of the women that I explored during my time in the library. And to end, I just want to again express my appreciation for the honor of being able to work with such a rich collection, and I look forward to sharing with the library the works that will come out of my research. Thank you.
Our next presentation is by Rini Yun Keagy, The Tropics, Race, Disease, and Colonialism. Rini is a moving image artist based in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Her practice in video and 16mm film is multimodal and research-based and investigates race and labor, disease, and sites of historical and psychosocial trauma. She is a recipient of the McKnight Media Artist Fellowship and Jerome Foundation Film and Video Grant. She earned her MFA in Film and Media Arts from Temple University and her BA in Geography from University of California, Berkeley. Rini, if you want to come up.
Sorry. Thanks everybody for coming out. That video is going to be hard to top. That was really interesting. Before I run out of time, I wanted to make sure that I thank everybody who helped me through this residency at the library. So obviously Linnea Andersen for administrating and making everything run smoothly, Cecily Marcus as well, Lois Hendrickson and Emily Beck and Chris Hertzberg from the Wangenstein Historical Library. I don't know if anybody's here. Hi, Lois. Daniel Nika, Ellen Engseth from the Immigration History Research Center Archives. I know that Ellen's here. So I tried to use more archives than I could. So I did have some conversations with Ryan Matke. We looked at some Guatemala maps. And then from the Biomedical Library, Shonda Hunt, Caitlin Bacher really helped me on cull some materials that I probably will use in the future, but there was just not enough time. And then I had a discussion with Ryan Bean at the YMCA Archives. So I should say that this talk is going to be solely on my research in the Wangenstein Historical Library. So earlier in May, I did a talk, a lunchtime talk, where I talked about my research in the Immigration History Research Center Archives. So I'm kind of leaving that aside because I did talk for that entire time on that. And I've kind of been going between the two libraries since late January, early February. And in the IHRCA, I was mostly looking at one collection, which was the United States Committee for Refugees and Immigrant Records, because I'm kind of doing this project on the Guatemalan Civil War and looking at kind of firsthand documentation, United Nations and Amnesty International documentation on the war, especially in the 1980s, and refugee migration to the United States. But at the Wangenstein Historical Library, what I was really interested in, I've always been interested in disease and medicine, even though I'm not a doctor. I don't work in the medical field in any way, shape, or form. But I'm especially interested in, nowadays, rare or unexplained diseases that seem to kind of be cropping up a lot, potentially because of a lot of the ways that humans have reshaped our planet with GMOs and all, also just the kind of radioactive waves that are in the air, and a lot of these things have not been completely researched, but a lot of people are having certain symptoms that really are still unexplained. And so it's really interesting to work in the Wangenstein collection because that spans from, I think, the 1460s to 1930, and just kind of looking at this, a sort of a different perspective on diseases that then I would kind of go and do sort of some contemporary research on and kind of see where the gap is between those things and what the research has been. So I'm also especially interested in tropical and mosquito-borne diseases, illnesses of exclusion, autoimmune diseases. Excuse me, I just got back from Cuba and I got a cough there that I still have not gotten rid of, so it's appropriate. But I'm interested in sort of tropical medicine, especially because I spent the first 6 years of my life in Guatemala. I myself contracted a mosquito-borne illness, which was encephalitis, and I was in a coma for over a week, and supposedly, I don't know how they came up with the statistic, but they said I had 30% chance of living, and it's kind of miraculous that I'm even here, because I do have a lot of weaknesses, but I've kind of been finding out throughout my life that some of those weaknesses might have stemmed from that early experience of getting encephalitis. So, a lot of the materials that I'm going to be showing you some, excuse me, images of are coming out of the kind of a colonial period, right? Where, especially if I'm looking at tropical regions, and in Africa, thank you. Thanks. I tried to sort of combine some of my research with the Immigration History Research Center archives and look at Latin American illnesses, but really I thought it started becoming more rich when I really kind of expanded that into Africa and other regions. So, because there are some similarities, obviously, in just the kind of colonial mentality of all of those places. And that most of these materials were from a perspective of like a colonial doctors or medical system that were there, and also just changing the environment because of mosquitoes and things like that. So the first, I'll kind of go into just encephalitis a little bit. So there's a kind of strain of the disease called Encephalitis lethargica, or sometimes it's called epidemic encephalitis. And there was this book by John Hall from 1924. So that's kind of the introduction there. It's also known as sleeping sickness, but interestingly, the same exact word is used for a different disease called sleeping sickness, which is not transmitted by a mosquito, but by a tsetse fly. And there's a whole another book that I will show you that's sort of about that sleeping sickness. So this epidemic encephalitis, or Encephalitis lethargica, was first described by neurologist Constantine von Economo in 1917. But it probably existed long before that. And encephalitis, of course, is a disease that affects the brain. Usually it's a swelling of the brain. It attacks the brain. And in this case, it leaves victims in a kind of statue-like condition, speechless, motionless, and sometimes it leads to a coma. So I was really interested in this book because there were images, which, you know, they start, you probably can't see it all that well, but I'm going to read some of the captions. This one says, man, age 39, diagnosed as atypical paralysis agitans in 1916. Note the slight bending forward of the head and trunk, the position of the hands, and the facial expression. The illness began whilst serving on the British front in 1916. It's kind of, I mean, it's sort of hard to note. I mean, what is unfortunately a little bit comical about these photographs, and I'll show you several more, is that from a contemporary standpoint, we think of it as, well, that could just be staged, or, I mean, they're so slight that it's really hard to kind of notice some of these symptoms, but I'm really interested in this type of documentation where it was like, here's a photograph of somebody with these symptoms where they can't move and they can't, and they're not speaking and they're in a sort of paralytic state, and it's really hard to photograph that. So another one, sorry, this one is just actually kind of microscopic cells. Uh-oh, more microscopic cells, okay. So here are two other images from that series. So this first one is that this man has an epidemic encephalitis, acute stage with profound lethargy. There were extreme nystagmoid movements, which I'm not sure what that means, with facial and ocular palsies varying from day to day. This one is from an original series of cases reported in April 1918. And then to note the image next to it, which doesn't necessarily appear next to it in the book, but is a young girl, and the caption is, prolonged stupor in young girl, note the position of hands. 5 years later, she has completely changed in character and has a permanent retraction of the head with intermittent closure of eyes, drawing back of the lower jaw, and a harsh nervous cough. And I'm just going to show you a couple more that maybe start getting sort of less staged looking because there is kind of an issue with the way that the eyes are. One of them, the slide of the boy on the left, he has a paralysis of the left internal rectus as residuum of severe ocular lethargic attack. Bilateral facial paralysis was present but has disappeared. And again, some permanent change of character also followed. The man has kind of a similar situation. The one that I thought was most striking was this one of this woman, and she has post-encephalitic Parkinsonism with marked catatonia in a young woman. Note the immobile, expressionless face and catatonus. The arms were placed passively in this position with no request to hold them there. This patient also has marked disorder of the blinking reflex at times. So in looking at these images, my question started sort of becoming, I sort of noticed, at least in this very small sample, that the women seem to be kind of treated a little bit differently in terms of the photographs than the men. Like in the case of the young girl, she's like half naked and like laying in this position that, you know, it seems a little bit obscene. And in this case, it just kind of reminds me of all the sort of images of women who are experiencing quote unquote hysteria by placing, also they admit that they've placed her hands in that position. And so I'm interested in sort of the ethics around that, and also I would be sort of just interested in, you know, because I should mention that even though I worked on a project and I showed a clip from a film that I've been working on that will utilize some of my research from the Immigration History Research Center archives, I haven't actually made a project with the Wangenstein collection stuff, but I'm going to be sort of throwing you some ideas that I have of some of this stuff, which in this case, like I would want to maybe sort of restage some of these photographs and kind of combine them with maybe a history of not only kind of the sort of the ethics around the medical profession and photography, but also how sort of like photography's, the function, purpose, and the kind of technologies around photography have changed a lot. And because it's really interesting that, that was the technology that they had to sort of show this, right? But also there's the hand of the maker involved there. So just kind of going along in the same vein, there's also this book that was called Cases of Apoplexy and Lethargy with Observations upon the Comatose Diseases from 1812. So apoplexy is like an unconsciousness or an incapacity, usually resulting from a hemorrhage, a cerebral hemorrhage, which is different from encephalitis, but can also end with coma. And coma cases, a lot of these case studies, like the whole book is all these case studies, and they're actually really quite sad. And so this book I just noted for the plates in the end, which have these detailed illustrations of brains that were basically dissected after the person had died. And again, like you probably can't see it very well, but they're very detailed drawings and descriptions of what's going on in the brain. And I would be really interested, I know that, obviously technology and the study around the brain has changed so much. It would be really interesting to kind of like compare that. In fact, I was just hearing this radio show the other day, how this guy who was studying he was looking at brain waves in psychopaths because he studied criminals, and then he decided to do kind of an experiment on himself, and he discovered, did you hear this on Radio Lab? And he discovered that he himself had the same patterning and that he was also a psychopath, which was really kind of interesting. But this one was also, this illustration was kind of interesting. And then just looking at this electroencephalography, early on, this is 1949, so these really early EEGs, where they're looking at the activity, like what is happening to some of these patients who are going into either a coma or who have encephalitis, and then there's all these, there's descriptions and case studies of those on the side there. Okay. So interestingly, in terms of coma, because I'm really interested in coma, and for whatever, I know that Lois tried to help me a lot with coma. I think that for some reason it hadn't been studied a whole lot up until 1930, and we didn't get a lot of information on coma. I think it was still just very much like an observed sort of symptomatic kind of thing. But interestingly, I discovered that there's a doctor who he's a neurologist that works at Mayo Clinic in Rochester. His name is Dr. Elko Wijix. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. But he wrote a book in 2006 where he studied 30 Hollywood films that depict coma. And he is thinking that he's going to, I'm sorry, in the book, or sorry, this was actually an article in a neurology magazine, that it's depicted very inaccurately, and he was extremely mad about that, but it would be interesting to kind of take all of those scenes and do something with that. So because I don't have much time, I'm gonna just wrap up really quickly and just maybe go through some of the mosquito-borne illnesses and some of these illustrations that I found of mosquitoes. This is a whole different topic, but it really has to do with how we have been combating sort of mosquitoes for centuries, and it's still going on. I was just in Miami where just in 2018, but some of these are really beautiful illustrations of mosquitoes, and that's even like an egg boat of a mosquito larva. But in 2018 in Miami, they released male mosquitoes carrying a certain bacteria that when they breed with female mosquitoes, those female mosquitoes cannot lay eggs, or basically their babies will die. And they're still trying to figure out what will happen, or if it has helped at all, because in other cases it has not helped. So I'll just wrap it up there. I had some more, but in the interest of time, these are all sort of pictures of a kind of colonial expedition to Príncipe Tomé Sao Tao. and Principe, or Sao Tome and Principe, which is off the coast of Equatorial Guinea in Africa. So I'll just leave it there since I'm out of time, but thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rini. Thank you, Rini. So our final presenter is Johnnay Leenay, Finding Community, Finding Yourself, The Journey of Ana Silva, Finding Her Place in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Johnnay Leenay earned a BA in Communications and Journalism and Justice and Peace Studies from the University of St. Thomas and is currently the first Diversity in the Arts Curatorial Fellow at the Minnesota Museum of American Art. Her residency focuses on historical queer spaces in the Twin Cities and how they have shaped the queer community in Minnesota today. Johnnay, come on up.
Okay, so just some background for my project. So I initially got connected with the Treasure Collection through an exhibition I curated last summer at my job at the Minnesota Museum of American Art. And the show is called We the People, and so it was looking at how do you define America and Americanness in 2017. And so through that, I really wanted to focus on queerness and transness and subverting that as been seen as so anti-American for so many years. So that's when I first got connected with the Treasure Collection, and I worked with Andrea Jenkins, bringing some of the people who she recorded for the Trans Oral History Project to be physically in the space at VM. And so I was really interested in kind of like diving more into the Treasure Collection and seeing there's so many more stories to be told. And so that's kind of like my first entryway here. And then this last 2 years has been a very contested time in the queer scene in Minneapolis. A lot of places have been closing. For example, Cafe Southside, Intermediate Arts, and Patrick's Cabaret, just to name a few, have all been shutting down and closing the last couple of years. And so I've been thinking critically about what does that mean for the queer community in Minnesota today, and what does that look like historically when people, these spaces that have been used, have been for and built for queer people, what do people do when they no longer exist? So that was kind of what was jumbling in my head while I was digging through the Treasure Collection. So my initial proposal was really kind of mapping out historical spaces, and I want to have an exhibition really focusing in having memorabilia from the Treasure Collection along with mapping out different historical spaces. But as I was thinking about that, and I know I didn't have a physical space to put that, and the University of Minnesota didn't have a place to have an exhibition as well, and so I was thinking critically about how do I have this mapping live outside of just a 2-week span or outside of this conversation per se. And so when I was digging into the collection, I came across one woman in particular, Ana Silva, who is a Latina lesbian Jew still located in Minneapolis. And she donated 14 boxes to the Treasure Collection. So looking into her collection, she had everything in there, from photos from when she was a child to graduating from physical therapy school, tons and tons of journals kind of like talking about not feeling she is Latina enough, not being gay enough, not being Jewish enough, and like really kind of diving into her poetry and poems and just like really being critical of who she is in the Minnesota landscape. And so I felt like I had a weird connection with this woman, and just from reading her like journal entries. And as someone who journals, I've never once thought about someone reading my journals. And so I felt really like brave that she was able to like share that with people, and the collection is open for people, anyone in the public, and so people can really kind of dive into her life. And so I was really interested in kind of mapping out her life and not so holistically of a queerness in Minneapolis. And I really wanted to, since she was still alive, to like talk with someone about what does that look like, why did you go to this space, and how has this made an impact in your life. And so from all that, I kind of made an interactive story map with our GIS program through the University of Minnesota. So hold on, I have to get, we went through this, I had a slide thing. Oh no, how do I do this again? Okay. Boom, sweet, thank you. So here's like the first kind of round of this interactive story map. So it's focusing on Ana Silva, like I talked about, and she's 58 years old. And from over here, you can see I've kind of pinpointed a couple spots in her life. And when I first met with her, I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted. I just wanted to talk to her, kind of hear about her life in a more like personal way. And when I was asking about places that she frequented in the 1980s when she first came to Minneapolis, she talked about 3 spots in particular. One was Powderhorn Park, where she lived for 16 years of her life, and I currently live. The Savansney Community Center, where Stir Fry, the first known lesbian of color organization, met. And then the Woman's Coffee House. And so from those 3 spots, she really kind of dove into like, what those spots meant for her and why she went to them, why she created Stir Fry, and just kind of looking at all those spaces in particular. And then I've kind of mapped out a couple other spaces where she first lived when she moved here, her first job here. And throughout the summer, I'm going to connect with her and kind of map out a couple other places where she frequented. But in the beginning, I really was focusing on the 3 initial spots. And so here, I videotaped her in all the different locations and just kind of hearing about her background with them. And so I won't go through all the videos because there's a ton, but I will go through a couple ones I think kind of showcase really the importance of her life. And so one in particular was Powderhorn Park, and she first was connected to Powderhorn Park in 1982. And I'll just kind of play the clip about how she first got connected to Powderhorn from her own words.
We had
Okay.
gay pride here one year, way back in the day. That was the best. Can you imagine? Gay pride, the parade comes right here to the park, and the festival is in the park. It was the best.
And so there's just one clip of her talking, and then it's from this. I was really interested in how the parade was in Powderhorn, and I know historically it's been in Loring Park, and currently it's still in Loring Park, and so like, why was it in Powderhorn that year? And so I kind of dove into the Pride archives and looked at where each of them were historically, and then I came across the 1982 file, and 1982 was a very contested time for Pride in Minneapolis. And just some historical background, so 1981 was the first Pride that the word lesbian was used with a lot of the advertisements and t-shirts and all like the advertisements around getting people to come to Loring Park. And so 1982 comes around and the word lesbian was used in 1981, lesbian and gay pride. And then in 1982, the all-male planning committee decided to take the word lesbian out and just went back to the gay pride. And so 1981 was seen as a time of like unity and getting together and kind of coming together for a collective good of queerness. And then 1982 comes around and they decide to take that word out. And so a very angry group of small lesbians came together and talked about they weren't happy with that. And a lot of them were on boards and other committees in the Pride committee, but they weren't in the top one. And so they didn't have a say in that. But they've been doing a lot of work to make sure Pride was happening in the last 13 years. And so they decided to have a counter Pride, and that was one that took place in Powderhorn Park. And so it was really interesting kind of hearing Anna's perspective of it, first of all, and just how excited she was, and then looking at the Treader collection and seeing what historically was happening. And so if you continue on into this story map, you can see Anna sent me some pictures of some of her favorite times in Powderhorn Park. And then look closely here, there's been a lot of news articles in the 1982 archives talking about why there was a parade in Powderhorn. And so look here, Pride group snubs lesbians, boycott called. And this article kind of gives some background to why it was happening. And then each part of the map, I give kind of a historical background a little bit more, if someone couldn't hear me talk right now, but still can kind of see what was happening in 1981 to 1982 and why there was a different parade that year. And then you continue down, go down the map. I have some other clips of her just talking about her identity in Powderhorn Park and how she felt as being a lesbian, Latina, and Jewish. She felt all of her identities were seen at Powderhorn Park. And she sends more photos along, just talking about a couple of her favorite plants that she's come across in Powderhorn. And continuing on down the map, so she lived at Powderhorn for 16 years of her life. And so I have some photos of where she lived throughout that time and plan to map that across Powderhorn throughout the summer. And so that's kind of just one small clip of what I've been working on and for Powderhorn Park. And then next I'll talk about Stir Fry, which is kind of my first connection with Anna and why I really want to dive into her life. And so when she moved to Minneapolis in 1980, she was having a lot of community issues and not understanding her Latina side. And growing up, she said she was raised very white, and she was raised Italian like her father. And so she came to Minneapolis wanting to find a Latina community, wanting to really kind of dive into that part of herself. And so she looked around and didn't really see a lot of spaces that were for queer people of color. And so she decided to start her own. And so here's kind of a background, a beginning of Stir Fry through Anna's perspective.
I started Stir Fry in 1982. I put up flyers around Powderhorn in the co-ops and in the lesbian, or the GLBT newspaper at the time. That was before Lavender. Well, I started Stir Fry because I didn't have any connections to people of color. I was raised white and as Italian, and I've got white skin privilege, and so, you know, I didn't have any Latina friends. I didn't have any women of color friends or men, or I didn't have anybody in my life like that. It's just, you know, I was just a typical white girl, and then I thought, wow, I'm not this typical white girl. I got all this stuff going on. And I just wanted to connect with other lesbians of color because I didn't want to be like hanging out by myself as far as around that issue like I had been. And I didn't like being like, well, to me, I felt like I was lied to, but I understand that was just the way that she saw things, and people do see things differently in different countries. Things are perceived differently. So I started this group because I wanted to connect with other lesbians of color, and a bunch of women came, about 8 or 10 women came, and they were all African American dykes, all of them and me.
And so from that interview, I will kind of dive more into just, she says a lot of personal things about feeling she's been lied to, and kind of diving into her family history, about how her and her mother didn't have the best relationship, and how they never really talked about her being Latina, and her mother always kind of pushing that aside. And it kind of came to light one day when she was younger, when she came across her mother's ID, and her mother identified as white. And she felt a lot of issues with that, like, no, we are Latina, and when people look at me, they can tell I'm not completely white. And why are you trying to like erase that from my history and from my narrative? And so I will kind of talk more about that in a paragraph underneath this. But in the meantime, we have some photos from the archives of the flyers she hung around town. And there's also a clip talking about the impact of Stir Fry in the lesbian community. And as a lesbian of color today in Minneapolis, I was really interested in seeing what she learned in the 1980s and what we can take from it now, and different ways we can make it better and make it more inclusive for people. And so she does a lot of great advice and just like background of starting a group and not working into her favor, but still like seeing the importance of like having community space and bringing people together, even if it doesn't work in your own personal advantage. And so those are just kind of some clips of what I've been working on. I make it so difficult having to switch different things. Oh, I got it, don't worry. Figured it out. And so, blah, blah. So just a quick disclaimer, this is just one person's viewpoint, and she's also Latina and very light skinned. And we had a lot of conversations about like, what does that look like being a person of color? And so I know she talked a lot about her roommates and black friends she had in the 80s who had it a lot worse or better or what have you. And I just want to make sure that this is understood. That's just one person's viewpoint, and she's not speaking for the whole lesbian community in the 1980s. It's just really what she felt in her personal experience. And everyone had different experiences. And I just thought it was really important because I know there's been a lot of conversation around Harvey Milk and Marsha P. Johnson who deserve the credit, but I'm also really interested in how we have like superheroes in our own backyard who've made it okay for me to be an out lesbian here and a person of color, and really kind of like hone into those stories that a lot of people don't know and don't hear about. And she's still alive and kicking it here, so I thought it would be really cool to talk to her. And some thank yous, of course, to the University of Minnesota for having me, Linnea Andersen and Lisa Ficoli, who would message me back when I emailed them 2 hours before, wanting to get a box, quick. the M where I work, who gave me time off for professional development to work on this passion project. Andrea Jenkins, who was my first connection with the Treasure Collection and really kind of understood my want to kind of dive more into all the stories that potentially could be told and should be told from the archives. Aja Gildersleeve helped me a lot with the videography work that you saw there. And then, of course, Anna Sylvia, who couldn't be here tonight, but just her, like, being so authentic with who she is and being open and honest to, like, share her stories and what worked and what didn't, and just being, like, a goofball with me in the park. So, yeah. That's it. Thanks, y'all.
So we have just a little time for some question and answer. So Rini and Johnnay, if you could come up to our comfortable table we've prepared for you. Terrific. I have a question. Does anyone have a question they want to start with to begin? Johnnay, actually, I'm going to put you on the spot and start with you and ask a little bit more about the process of creating that map, kind of sort of some of the challenges or sort of how you went about it or how you came up with the idea. I know some of the staff in the room definitely would be interested, and hopefully some of the guests as well.
So when I was thinking of an exhibition, I was thinking of printing out or having like a wall dedicated to a map of Minneapolis. Not done by me, but in some capacity having just this whole map and then me pinning the points there. And so when I kind of disregarded the exhibition and wanting something a little bit more tangible, I was like, how does this work? And so I kind of had like a brain dump session with Linnea and a couple other people at the U talking about what I potentially wanted in this like uppity world of like if everything could work out in my dreams. And they kind of like led me to the ArcGIS map, and it's amazing. It's really easy, like user-friendly. And so with that, I had to create kind of like an Excel sheet that got dumped with all the locations. So I picked like the 5 different locations I had up there, the coordinates, and then how I want to name it. And then that got dumped into this, the map there. And I don't exactly know the process of what that looks like, but all of a sudden it got populated. And it worked out. So I don't exactly know like the fine-tuned details of it, but I know I don't have, like, ArcGIS is a very expensive program, and I guess the guy who invented it went to the U, so y'all get it for free. And so I was very fortunate to have access for it for the next couple of months as I dive into it, because being a independent worker, I would not be able to access that on my own accord, because it's crazy expensive.
I have a question. Oh, you go first.
All right, this is for you, Rini. I really like science technology stuff, and I used to work at JPL where they were coming up with satellites to track mosquito diseases across the country.
JPL?
Oh, NASA Jet Propulsion Lab. And I was working with satellite technology in terms of like bridging the gap between government agencies and government agencies doing work, and they were getting involved with tracking mosquito-borne illnesses. That was one of their main like go-tos. And then also I have connection with like Google Verily, their healthcare department or their health like startup, and their main forefront is mosquito-borne illnesses too. And I was interested in like your opinion on government involvement with mosquitoes, and I think you're on to something for sure.
Well,
Thank you
yeah.
for a great presentation too.
Thank you. There are so many organizations that are doing this like worldwide. It's one of the world's mission is to somehow eradicate mosquitoes, and apparently more humans have died from mosquito-borne illnesses than anything, which was a statistic that I was really surprised about. Sorry? Yeah, so, it's just interesting that nowadays it's getting to be that there are these corporations, just like with 23andMe, corporations are basically taking over science. So it's interesting. I mean, like governments do it, but also corporations, and oftentimes then governments are just outsourcing corporations. So the one that was in Miami, it's this, I was going to show you this little video of it's like this little animation that this company called Mosquito Mate did to advertise their campaign for Miami, and I'm sure that it was done in collaboration with the city government. What I didn't get to in the presentation is kind of, I'm really interested in the idea that this kind of a mosquito eradication program really started with the Colonialist Project, right? And so the kind of like all the language that's used around that, there were a couple of book covers, it's like, how to treat your Negro slaves and how to live in tropical Africa, but they were really developed for the white people who were colonizing those countries and how to keep themselves healthy, right? And that the medical professions who have gone into these places oftentimes have really sort of treated the native populations there very differently, thinking that their body constitution was completely different and all of these things, right? So I'm really kind of interested in that and how nowadays the mosquito eradication project is still going on, but in a very sort of different way and maybe with kind of collaboration between a lot of different countries.
Related to that, I noticed hey, what's up? While you were wrapping up very quickly, I noticed you had a slide titled Indigenous Medicine. So I was wondering if you could maybe touch on that as you just mentioned the corporate side of eradication.
So that was just one of my interests in going into the Wangenstein Historical Library. I just wanted to see if there was anything on Indigenous medicine. And really the only thing, one of the only things that I found was from, it was a Mexican obstetrician, I can never say that word, who wrote a book on
obstetrician.
Yes.
Way to go, y'all.
And I'm also thinking of it in Spanish because it's written. The whole book is written in Spanish, but it's about that topic, and it's a Mexican doctor, and really it's a huge volume that has, I think, 2 huge parts, and there were maybe 4 or 5 pages where he's observing the indigenous population or the Mayan populations. Practices and rituals around childbirth. And what's interesting, and Lois, maybe you can help me with this, the pages had not been cut yet. I'm not sure what they're called, those big folio pages. So I was the first person, it was a book from 1910, I believe, and I was the first person to look at that, at least in this particular volume, right? And so there are these little illustrations of those practices. And interestingly, when I was in San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas, and there's sort of a museum about sort of ritual, Mayan ritual practices around childbirth. And it's something that a lot of Westerners are trying to, study. And there's also, because it deals with a lot of herbal remedies as well. But then I also noticed when I was reading that section that, like a lot of sort of Catholic sort of colonization to the Latin America, there's this kind of like weird blend of sort of indigenous practices with also Catholic prayers. And so obviously you have to kind of look at when that was being written, because it was being written sort of after that mix of cultures had happened.
This is another kind of mosquito-related thing. It's not a question, but just part of kind of what we do here as archivists and curators are also to be aware of other collections. And I know this is an artist in residency here, but I just wanted to make you aware of a collection that I'm familiar a little bit with, just because it was created by somebody who gave us his huge Sherlock Holmes collection. But this is the Philip Hench, Walter Reed Yellow Fever collection. It's at the University of Virginia, and it's 153 boxes, and there's an online finding aid for it. So if you ever want to explore in that part of the country, it might be worth a visit.
Thank you. I'll have to take that note from you. The mosquito illustrations came from the bulletin, the yellow fever bulletin. And yeah, so there's been like a lot of extensive research on that, but that sounds like a huge collection. Thank you. It's just amazing to me that this has been studied for centuries, right? And we cannot combat the mosquito. Yeah.
I have a question for both of you. When we were first envisioning this artisan residency program, we really wanted to emphasize the exploratory aspect of an artist working in the archives, not requiring a finished product at the end or a finished project. And perhaps it is a bit like the book from 1910 that hadn't been read for 100 years, that perhaps the fruits of this work may not even show up until a later project. So I'm just wondering if you each could talk a little bit about sort of the process of being derailed and going in different directions, and your own goals, and whether or not this has been a satisfying process or frustrating, and just also thinking in terms of how we might structure this to best support artists in the future.
So I kind of changed my project maybe a month and a half ago, which was terrifying. Because I really thought about doing the exhibition, and I really wanted something tangible, and I was thinking, I'm spending so much time in these archives and learning so much, like, it's not fair that I'm the only person that can, like, have this opportunity. So I wanted to make the map for other people to actually look at it, and I'm also, in a very selfish way, thinking of applying to grad school and, like, using that as, like, a sample. I'm really interested in, like, mapping out historical spaces and looking at queer archives and working with the Treader collection. It's so interesting. I was going through, like, Anna, she kept, for some reason, every, like, happy birthday and thank you card she received from, like, 1982 to, like, 1991. And I read through all of them, and I learned so much through her life, and I think it's really interesting what we think is important to collect and what we don't think is important to collect. And when I was talking with her, she was like, I never thought anyone would actually read any of this stuff. And I was like, I've read through it all. So I think it's really interesting thinking about, like, why we collect certain things, especially, like, queer archives. And a lot of it historically has been, like, underground or destroyed or not seen, put into light, because it's been such a scary thing and something that people get to jail for, killed for, what have you. And so, like, really thinking critically about things that are just in people's basements and their grandma's, like, attic, and, like, those are important things that some, like, interesting 25-year-old is super excited to read through all your thank you notes. But a lot of people don't think of that. And so it's been really fun kind of, like, diving into it and seeing different ways that you could come across it. And I thought I did not think at all I'd be focusing on one person. I really was interested in looking holistically at, like, Minneapolis and queer spaces that no longer existed. And then it's been fun just kind of, like, going through that and thinking of how you define queerness has really made me challenge mine. And even if these spaces don't exist, she's still a queer woman and she's still in a space. So does that automatically, like, inherently make it queer? And, like, kind of rethinking about, like, spaces and how, if just because it's not defined for you, by you, doesn't mean you can't redefine it. And so it's just been a lot of, like, understanding of, like, how we deal with spaces and all that jazz. So it's been, I guess, I answered maybe a couple of those questions. But overall, it's just been fun, and I'm very fortunate that Linnea and Lisa kind of, like, were okay with me switching ideas and emailing, like, hey, I have a question. Do you have time to just, like, kind of, like, shoot the shit for a little bit, and be very open to just, like, talk and, like, help me, like, process things in a very, like, collaborative, like, informative way. They're like, yeah, if you have the resource, if you think you can do it, if you want to do it, like, I would love to see what you can create. And there was no parameters, which is kind of scary, but also amazing, because you could do so much. And I never thought I'd come across an interactive map, or I don't even really like maps. Google Maps kind of scare me still. But it's been fun to kind of, like, retest myself in ways I never thought I would, like, go in my research personally.
Can I ask you, so how much did it change? Is it just that you didn't know you were going to make the interactive map, but your project was very similar in the beginning, or how much did it change? Because you said you set out to do something different and you changed it.
I think my proposal was I don't know why I thought I could do this, which is kind of silly looking back now, but I was interested in picking out a couple places that historically were queer spaces that are no longer, and going to these spaces and having an exhibition there. And I want to be a traveling exhibition at some point of that. And I looked at one space in particular in the beginning, and I remember I called them, and they, like, the person was just like, I think it was like a Starbucks now, and they were like, I have no idea, like, they were like concerned, like, do I talk to corporate? And they were confused. And so then I went in and tried to talk to a manager, and the manager wasn't very, like, helpful. Like, I like your idea, but I don't think we can hang anything on the walls. And then I was like, okay, at like a coffee shop where people like can like spill coffee. And then I was like, well, I literally can't take anything from the Treader collection to a busy coffee shop. But like, I was like, maybe I can like print things out and put them up. But like, that one experience was like so negative with them that they were just like interested. Like, the worst part, they were really interested. They just logistically couldn't do it. And so I was like, oh, this may not be what it could be. And so I was like, okay, what's a different version? And I was like, there could be a map of these spaces. And then I was like, but there's no actual space to put this exhibition. I was like, I can talk about it here and potentially like think about like a exhibition proposal and maybe write a grant. But then it's that idea of like maybe writing a grant, and what does it look like? Am I going to be done with it at the end of this residency, at the end of my fellowship at my museum? Like, am I going to come back to it 5 years from now? And I really just wanted something I could take with me now and appreciate and see what I've been doing, and not just this heady idea of it all.
Is the map online?
Yes, it's public now, but I was not complete. I still have a lot of work to do, and I'm going to do it throughout the summer. But yeah, it is something that people can look at, and that's why I'm really intentional about like having the paragraphs after each video clip that kind of give more context, especially because she talks a lot about like family dynamics that you'd have no idea about if you didn't talk to her for like the 3 hours that I did. And so having those like paragraphs underneath that kind of give more context for just if a random person came across this could get something from it, or at least see where she was coming from and why she picked this certain space.
So if you couldn't tell, I didn't finish my presentation because I tend to go down rabbit holes and ramble. And so to answer your question, like what this, or your many questions, it's always hard when you set out to do something and then you feel like, wow, I'm so overwhelmed because I did go down so many rabbit holes that I kind of sort of lost focus sometimes. And sometimes I was frustrated because I couldn't find the things that I was looking for. And I mentioned this in the lunchtime talk too, but that, one thing that people of color always have to come to terms with is that a lot of times the things that you're looking for just don't exist, and it's always kind of mediated by the voice of the people who owned the archives and who were the people who decided to collect things. And so a lot of the stuff that you think theoretically should be there just does not exist because they weren't kept, they weren't archived. So one of the things was that, I was really, really looking for sort of firsthand perspectives from refugees themselves, right, in the Immigration History Research Center archives. And that really didn't exist because it was always mediated by the voice of an organization that is, supposedly helping these refugees, right? And so that just first person voice just wasn't there, and obviously I kind of knew with the Wangenstein collection that I wouldn't find that just based on the kind of the years that, but we're talking about, half a millennia, right? And then it's only really in this century that we're starting to sort of have some of those things. And so it's always hard sort of dealing with that, but that's part of what, I had to kind of think through these things and sort of like, okay, so how do I sort of start creating that voice? And that's, the point of the artist residency, right? What am I going to do with these materials to start kind of creating that voice, having that voice be somewhere in the narrative? So that to me was really interesting. And also, I think it was really fascinating to and I think I said this in my proposal as well, that I really was excited about working with tactile materials. I think we're also used to doing internet research these days, and there's, obviously so much more than that, and it was really nice actually having to be stripped down before going into the reading room, and you can't take anything, you can't take your jacket, you can't, you take a pencil and your computer maybe, and that was really nice as well, to just kind of be in there and know that you can't be sort of distracted by, you actually can be distracted by the internet, because you could take your phone in there and you need it to take pictures of things, but at the same time, it just was a really, really contemplative space that I really, really enjoyed, and I really wish I had more time for it, honestly. It's like we all don't have much time in our lives, and that's something that I really wish, I could do. But also, it kind of forces you also to be really selective in what you're looking at, right? You have a pile of things, and you might just skim through certain things, and then others you might really delve into more, but you wish you could also delve into this as well. So, but it was really, it's a really great, this is why I was so excited when I applied, and so I think it was a really great time, and unfortunately I had this other artist residency that took me out of town for 4 weeks as well, so I would have wanted more time, but like you, I might also come back during the summer and continue this work.
Hi, this question's for Johnnay. Is that how you say your name? Johnnay. What was it like to have both the documents from a historical time period and then the person themselves, like reflecting back on that time period? Was it something did you have any thoughts about that? I just find that kind of exploratory process taking you out of the archives really interesting within the same collection.
No, yeah, it was a lot of fun, and it really kind of brought things to life, like having the conversations with Anna, and then also seeing stuff in the archives. And it was really, I think the most fun was seeing her remember things, and oh, I saw this, or in June 3rd, 1982, you were here, do you remember that? And she wrote a lot of poetry, and I think I was most attracted to that in the beginning, how authentic she was about trying to find out who she was in life. And just seeing her kind of go back into that time and talking about things that she hasn't talked about in years, and about people she hasn't talked about in years. And a lot of her journal entries were about ex-girlfriends and her ex-wife and people she thought she was going to end up with, and building a life and a future with someone. And seeing her remember those things, it was really beautiful, just her face, and her, you can see kind of her losing her breath in a little bit, not hearing a name and 20 years, and what does that look like thinking about that person now and everything you thought about in that time. And it was really interesting, the part seeing the Powderhorn part, because she had no idea. So I talked to her about that and was all excited, and I was like, well, you're so excited about this one pride that happened in Powderhorn, but the rest of them have been in Loring Park, what does this look like, and blah blah. And so then that's why I dove into the Pride archives. And then I met with her this past weekend, and I was like, did you know that it was originally a space for woman-centric and lesbian people? And she was like, oh, that's why there are so many women there, and had no idea. And I was like, you're just part of history you don't even realize you are. And especially with everything that's happening in America right now, we're all living through history, and you don't know that you are until you think critically about it 20 years down the line. And just seeing her remember things, it was beautiful. And so it was really fun having her talk about something, and then it kind of being reinforced through the collection, and then also having her pictures from her own life. I've seen pictures of her kid and her ex-wives, and just places she's lived, and seeing all three of them put together really kind of made everything come to life in a way that I never thought I would see. And that's why I was really excited kind of diving into her life, and not just looking at historical spaces only, because it brought another level that I am really fortunate I got to see about the collection.
Thank you, Rini and Johnnay. Unfortunately, we're out of time for more questions. It's 8:15, but I encourage you to continue the conversation with the artists out in the atrium. We have a dessert reception.